guys, and welcome back to Edge-CGI, and in this tutorial we're going to create this balloon scene using Maya and Mesh. We'll also create a simple light setup as well as a simple shader using the latest Arnold. As a quick disclaimer, this tutorial is using Maya 2017, so the Mesh plugin is a fairly new addition. In fact, it was added in Maya 2016.5, so if you're using a Maya before that, you won't be able to follow along. Also, if you're using Maya 2016.5, you didn't have things like this mesh editor window. You had something that's very similar to this, and you should still be able to follow along, so it shouldn't be a problem. Now, if I just go to my preferences, make sure that you have Arnold loaded. Arnold now ships with Maya, I think since 2017, so you should be able to follow along, but you can also use any other renderer like Redshift or V-Ray and so on. The principles are going to be exactly the same. And as you can see, I'm running Arnold 2.1. So before we get started, I'll quickly run you through the setup so you can see what we'll be making. So traditionally, you should be able to create something like this, or you would create something like this using end particles probably. So you would run a particle simulation or scatter some particles and then instance some geometry on top of that. But now it's extremely quick to do the same thing using Mesh. So that's why we're using it. And if you can't see the Mesh menu, just make sure you go into your plugins, and it's gonna be Mesh right here, so make sure that it's loaded, and then you can find the menu on the animation Mesh, or if you're in a different tab, if you hold down spacebar, you can find a Mesh editor here as well. So to create this scene, we're going to need a couple of things. First, we'll create a balloon similar to this, and then basically we're going to create a container that we then scatter this balloon inside, and we're gonna fill this shape with all these balloons, and then we're gonna add some random offsets, rotations, and so on. And we'll also use Mesh to drive the random color of the balloon. So instead of having loads of different shaders, we can drive the whole thing with just one shader. So let's jump straight in. I'll start a new scene. Okay, so now that we have our new scene, the first thing to do is create the balloon geometry. And I already have these made, as I didn't want to waste your time watching me create a sphere basically. So this is actually just from a sphere, and then I just pulled in some edges to turn it into an egg shape. And then to create the container shape, it's pretty much the same thing. So I first made a sphere, and then using the sculpt tools, so if you shift right click, you can go to the sculpt tool, or if you go to the shelf sculpting, you can use things like the move tool. So if you hold down B and drag, you can change the brush size, and then you can move this shape around. Okay, so again, I just started with a sphere and then start shaping our container geometry. So once you have something that you're happy with, we can start using Mesh to scatter this geometry inside. So the first thing you need to do is open the Mesh menu, and if you're a beginner and you don't know how to open this menu, it's just holding down space. Alright, and then when you find a menu, just let go of space and it will open up the window. Cool, so now that we have our Mesh menu, select your balloon geometry and go on the create Mesh network, and you can see that it's already going to start distributing or instancing. As you can see, it's using a Maya instancer to instance that balloon geometry. And at the moment, you can see 10 of them in a row, because if you go under the Mesh Distribute tab, you can see that it's set to linear distribution type and the number of points is 10. So if I increase this, you can see how it's changing the instancer, and you can do some really cool stuff with this, but for now we're just going to cover how to fill this other object with our balloons. So what we need to do is go under the mesh settings. If you drag your object, so if I want my container geo into the mesh option, you can see how it's going to start putting our geometry onto that mesh. And in fact, we can just hide this one for now so we can see what's happening. You can hide things with Control H. If I go back to my mesh setting, you can see that you can scatter things onto other geometry really easily. Now the problem is that we don't really want to scatter inside on the mesh. We want to scatter inside it. So if you change the mesh method to voxel, you can see how it fills up our shape with loads of little balloons, which is really cool. Now the next thing to do is under the voxel setting, we need to change the size, because at the moment they're a bit too close to each other. So if you just go to the voxel settings and then increase the size, you can see how they'll be a bit more spaced out. So I'll just go with something like 2.7, and that looks pretty good. So as you can see, we already have a cluster of balloons, but everything is a bit too uniform right now. So what we need to do is we need to add some random rotation, scale, and some random positions. So if we go back to our mesh settings, you can see how there are loads of extra nodes that you can add onto this stack. So for example, if I wanted to add random rotation or random position to this, I can go under the random node and just add it. So now you can see we have our mesh distribute, and our random over here. It will also show up in here. Sometimes the editor doesn't update, and what you can do is just close it and reopen. And as you can see, we have our random node right here. And now you can see how all the positions are getting randomized. So at the moment, the random is only randomizing the position X, Y, and Z. And I also want to do some rotation. So I'll start dragging these sliders up, and now it's going to randomize between 0 and 20 degrees in an X. 0 and 16 degrees in a Y, and so on. So I'll just drag these up depending on how turbulent you want these balloons to be, but I don't want them to rotate too much. I just want a little bit of breakup. So that looks about right. Let's also add the random scale to this, just so they are not all the same size. And I only want it a little bit. Most of these balloons are going to be roughly the same size. Maybe that's a bit too much, so let's just go back to about 0.2. Okay, so something like that looks pretty good. Now the problem that we have is they're super dense, so they are still there's loads of them everywhere. So to stop this from looking so dense, we can add an extra node called a random visibility. So if we go under visibility, add visibility, and again you can see how an extra node gets added to our stack, and it has a random strength that we can drag down, and you can see how it's a bit more natural looking now as they are not so dense. So I'll just go with something like 0.7. Alright, so that's looking something like what we need. Now maybe I'll go back to my distribute or under my random, and I'll just change the position a bit more because they're still a bit too clustered together. It's not natural enough. Okay, so something like that looks pretty cool, so we can work with that. Okay, so you can mess around with loads more of these. You can also animate these, so you can make them move around randomly and so on. There are loads of mesh tutorials on the official Autodesk website, on the YouTube channel, so you can mess around with this a bit more in your own time. Now let's get to the lighting and rendering part. So first I'm going to create our render camera, and the first thing I'm going to do is rename this to our render cam. Okay, cool, and let's change the lens to something like a 200mm. So the reason why I'm picking a 200mm lens is because if we were on the ground and we were taking pictures of this balloon, we'd probably use a pretty long lens to see it, otherwise it would be really small on our screen, so it's a bit more realistic. Put my resolution gate on and make sure under my render settings I have Arnold renderer set, my render camera is set, and I'll just set this to HD 1080p for now. We'll be rendering half res anyway. So now that I have my camera, I'm gonna turn off my grid. Whoops, that's the wrong one. Turn off the grid, zoom in, and let's just go with something like this for now. And I'm just going to try to find a rotation where I find the balloons most appealing or most natural. So maybe something along this. Looks pretty cool. Okay, so for now I'll just go with something like this. And let's also assign a shader to these. So at the moment we have Lambert 1, and let's go ahead and hold down right click and go and assign the new material, Arnold, and AI standard surface. Now if you're using an older version of Arnold, you'll have something called AI surface, and you'll have slightly different options, but it's going to be fairly similar. Or you might have AL shaders installed, so you might have something like AL surface, which will be very similar to AI standard surface. So let's just assign the AI standard surface, and I'm going to rename this to balloon underscore material. Awesome. So the first thing I'm going to do is assign a diffuse color of 18% gray. And I'm not going to go into too much detail in this tutorial why 18% gray or the technical sort of breakdowns of all these attributes. If you want to learn more about rendering or physically based rendering and so on, there are many tutorials online, and I'll put some links in the description where you can learn more about this. Okay, so for now you can just follow along and plug in similar numbers and play around with these values, but I'm not going, for time's sake, I'm not going to go into too much detail about all of these. Okay, so I'll also put the roughness to like 0.4, IOR of 1.52 is fine, and let's open our Arnold render view. Okay, so now that we have the render view open, I'm just gonna position this somewhere where it's a bit more convenient for us. Cool, and let's hit IPR. So if you hit IPR, you can see that nothing is going to show up, but if you use this button, it will display the alpha, and you can see that there's something there. So we are definitely rendering from the correct camera, and I'll turn on progressive refinement as well. But the problem is that we haven't got a light yet, obviously. So let's pause the IPR and go to Arnold lights and create a skydome light. And a skydome light lets you pick HDRI as your lighting, which is it's very realistic if you have a high quality HDRI, and you can download one from Edge-CGI's website for free. So if you just pick file and pick this little folder and go into your source images and download one of these HDRIs from the Edge-CGI website for free, you can just, there's a TX or a HDRI, plug that in and make sure that your color space is set to raw, and you'll be able to tell in this little sample image can see how everything is super high contrast and it looks incorrect. As soon as you set it to raw, you can see that the green grass comes back and everything just looks a bit nicer. And I'm also going to rename this file to HDRI-F. Alright, so let's start IPR again, and you can see that we have these trees in the background from the HDRI, and we have some nice light on these balloons. So I don't really want to see this HDRI, so if you select your dome light and turn down the camera rays, everything's going to go black, and now we just see our balloons, which is great. Okay, cool. So before we tweak the lighting, another thing I like to do is I just like to make a sphere. So I can see that the lighting is coming from somewhere over here, but if you create a sphere and just move it in the top left corner. Also, ideally you want it around the same depth as these balloons, but for now I'll just leave it where it is. And I'll just assign a new material, an AI surface again, and I'll just make sure that this one's 18% gray. And I'll have a roughness of around 0.5. I might lower it, maybe a little bit more glossy. Okay, so now if I hold down Control Shift and drag, we can see the specular highlight from the sun. So maybe I'll increase this to like 0.45 so we can still see what's going on. Okay, cool. So now if you wanted to change the light direction, you can just go to our dome light and make sure we're on the shape, and you can just rotate it in the Y. So for example, something like 45 degrees. Okay, now it's full on, so that might not be ideal. I'll just leave it at 0 for now, so we're getting some nice light from the left. And if I shift drag over here, I can see my balloons. Okay, great. So the next thing we need to do now that our lighting is set up is some shaders. So first thing to do is we can set the colors with mesh, so that's super helpful. But first, as these are instances, we can't really pass the color values. So if we open mesh again, okay, the first thing we are going to do is add a mesh color node right here, and you can see that it's not going to let us add the color node. So if you go to this icon here and go to switch mesh geometry type, or if you're using Maya 2016.5, I think it's under modify, and there'll be a little mesh menu where it will let you switch the geometry type. So for now, I'm going to create switch mesh geometry type, and you'll notice that our instance has disappeared, and now we have this mesh repro mesh, and basically that's now converted to geometry instead of instances, and this allows us to pass vertex color from the instances to this geometry. And once we have vertex color assigned to these random vertex colors via mesh, we can then pass those values from the geometry to the shader. And this might sound a bit complicated at first if you've never done this before, but trust me, it's super simple. It allows us to basically add an attribute on the geometry, so you can visualize that each, for example, this geometry would have an ID of 0, 1, 0, which would be green because red, green, blue, right? So each of these geometry would have a random color ID that we can access with a node inside Arnold or Redshift or V-Ray. So most of these renders will all have a attribute lookup node that we can use to access this vertex color. Okay, so now that we have our mesh converted to a mesh, you can see if we go back to the mesh options, we now can add a random color. Okay, so now that we have a random color, I'll just pick, let's say, I'll start off with a value of 0.5, full saturation because I want this to be saturated, and we can add a random hue. So we want the hue to go all the way around the wheel, so I want a full random hue. Saturation maybe around 0.2 because I don't want desaturated balloons, and a value of maybe randomized by 0.2 because I don't want any super dark ones and I don't want any super bright ones, and we can always remap these later on. Okay, so this is going to create a random color, as I explained, on each of these balloons via vertex color. And if you go on your mesh node, you'll see that if you, I think it's under the repro mesh actually here. So if you select your mesh repro node, you can see that you have color per vertex enabled, and you can double check if you have color per vertex enabled on the geometry by going to mesh display and go to color set editor. And you can see that now it created this attribute called color set, and basically this is the attribute that Maya's using to store these values in the shader. Now if you render again, it's still going to be gray obviously because the Arnold doesn't know how to access this color. Okay, so if you go back to our shader, if you right click here and go to material attributes, you can see they're still pulling in this constant yet. So if I go to general editors, and I think they moved there actually, node editor, here we go. And if you never use the node editor, this might look a bit daunting at first, but if you select your balloon material and hit this arrow, it's going to come up with the shader, and we need to create a node called aiUserDataColor. Okay, and this is the node that will allow us to plug in that vertex color attribute and drive our shader with. Now in Redshift they'll have a separate node, and in V-Ray they'll have a separate node as well, but most renderers will have a node that allows you to access geometry, vertex color, or attributes. So if you use the aiUserDataColor, it will ask us for an attribute, and we can set this to be color set, and we know 100% that it's called a color set because we checked it, and that's what it is. And now we just need to connect this to our color. Now before we do that, I like to remap this. So if you make, a remap HSV, this will allow us to, instead of constantly adjusting this value in mesh, we can adjust it with a remap, which is a bit faster as it doesn't have to constantly update the geometry. So if you plug this into the color, and then we plug the remap HSV into the color, and I'm just middle mouse dragging this onto color. Let's just set the diffuse weight to 1 as well. If I render now, you'll notice that it still doesn't render, but now it's rendering black. The reason why it's rendering black is because the default value here is set to black, but I can change it to pink, and you can see that it's set to pink. Now this means that it sees this node being plugged in, but it still can't find the attribute. And the reason why is because in Arnold we need to set to export the vertex color on the geometry shape. So if we go back to repro mesh, and this time make sure you go under the mesh shape node, not the geometry node, and see here there's an Arnold menu, and if you pull that down, you'll see that there's an option called export vertex colors. Okay, so now Arnold will know that we want to export a vertex color from this geometry. So now if you render again, and Arnold sometimes doesn't update the cache properly, so just make sure that you set update full scene. And here we go. So now you can see that all our balloons have their unique colors being pulled in from the mesh options, getting remapped by the remap HSV. And the reason why the remap HSV is super handy is because we can drive the value interactively. So if everything's a bit too bright, we can bring it down. If things are a bit too saturated, I can desaturate them and so on. Whereas if you wanted to do the same thing with mesh, we can, but notice how Arnold is a lot more sluggish, because if I want to change something now, so let's say value random 0.5, okay, see how Arnold locks up, and basically it will update your scene every time because it needs to reload this geometry. So if you have a lot of these, it will be a lot slower than using a remap. Okay, awesome. So now we have our random colors. I'll just Control-Shift-Click to update my full scene. And this is the gist of the tutorial. At this point on, I just spent some more time doing look dev. So the other thing I did is, if I just zoom in here, the balloon is just a bit too, was a bit too diffuse. So you don't get that nice transparency coming through that you see with some balloons sometimes. So what I wanted to do is I just added some transmission to it, which is basically a refraction. So you can just pull this weight up a little bit, and as you can see, it will start going see-through a little bit, but ideally you want to see some color coming through. So a great trick to see what's going on is in Arnold you can add things called AOVs, and I'm sure most of you already heard about these, but if you haven't, they are super useful, and I'm not going to go too much into detail, but if you just add diffuse, specular, and let's just add transmission, okay, add. And now you can see we have 3 extra AOVs created, and I'm just going to start IPR again. And now if you go to diffuse, you can see your diffuse color, specular will be your specular, and transmission will be the refraction. Okay, and it's super useful because now if you want to tweak just the specular part of your render, you can just have this open, and you're not going to be distracted by the diffuse and so on if you have loads of things going on. So if you want to tweak just the specular, you can just look at the specular. Now we want to tweak transmission, so I just want to look at the transmission and not be all confused by all the things that are going on in my shader. So an extra thing that I like to do here to plug into refraction is I just grab another remap HSV node. Okay, and plug in the aiUserDataColor. And what I like to do is I like to bring the value up. Okay, and I like to desaturate it. And now I'm going to drive the transmission color by this, and that will give it a more natural feel. So if you look into transmission now, we can see our balloon refracting through, and you can tweak all these settings like the roughness of the refraction. So for example, if I wanted it to be not so smooth, then I can increase the roughness so we get more of a rubbery feel. So I'll just set this to like 0.2 or something, but I haven't got time to mess around with these settings too much. So feel free in your own time to mess around with these settings and do some more look dev in your own time. In the thumbnail image, you can see that I added a blue background and I added a little cloud in a foreground, and all of those things were done in comp. So in CG or in Maya, this is what I pretty much rendered as a final image. I just tweaked the shader a little bit more, and then in Nuke or Photoshop or your chosen or After Effects, whatever program you like to do your compositing with, bring this render in, add a cool blue background to it, maybe add a little bit of noise or something to break it up a little bit, and a nice little cloud in the foreground, slightly defocused, will get you to the same image that I had. Okay, so thanks for watching this tutorial, guys. Make sure you subscribe for more tutorials, and don't forget to let us know in the comments what tutorials you would like to see next. Thanks for watching. See you next time.